Hi everyone, welcome back to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome back to the show. Really great to have you all here again, and hope you're doing well. And today I have a returning guest, good friend of mine, a writer, very good writer, and just an all-round good human and fellow film fan. Douglas Humphries, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I think it just occurred to me that I think this is like my third time. So
It is that
yeah.
time, yeah. Hopefully not the last either.
Hopefully not. Hopefully not.
Yeah,
Certainly.
yeah. Douglas and I probably chat probably about once a week in the little group that we're part of, and we often talk about movies, and we talk about lots of other things as well, pretty much everything.
Mhm.
So we kind of thought we would talk about Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan's movie, which
Yep.
came out in July 2023, and because of it's such a powerful movie with lots of different themes and lots of things to think about, and we thought it'd be a good idea to talk about them. So here we are.
Absolutely. Yeah.
First, also, I want to say we're not bringing this podcast out until the writer's strike is over, because we want to show solidarity with writers and actors and directors and anyone who's on strike and isn't getting paid fairly. So this will not go out until that is over. And that's something we've both agreed beforehand. Both of us are writers, so we especially feel like are aware of the importance that creative people get paid well and get paid properly, and in full support of those people who are striking. So that's why this podcast is coming out when it is, whenever it comes out. I don't know when it's going to come out yet, because we don't know when the strike's going to be over yet. But so that's kind of our little thing of solidarity with those who are on strike at the moment. So we're going to talk about, and Christopher Nolan himself actually has shown some solidarity as well. The director of this movie said that he wasn't going to work on a new movie until the strike is over. So that's great as well from him. So here we are, Oppenheimer. It's I've lost count of how many movies Christopher Nolan has made now. Which number is this? I've seen all of them, but I can't remember. But there's so many now, I can't keep up. So we had Following, then we had Memento, then we had Batman. Insomnia. Then it was Batman Begins.
Yep.
Then it was The Prestige. Then it was The Dark Knight. Then Inception. Then The Dark Knight Rises. Then Interstellar, and then Dunkirk, Tenet, and Oppenheimer. Yeah, so that's a lot of movies. Probably into double figures now for movies. Anyway, so one of the great movie makers of our time, I think it's fair to say. Great storyteller. He's my favorite director, I think, probably. Just the fact that he shoots on film as well, doesn't use CGI. The story. I've been reading some of his scripts recently, including the one for this movie, and they're brilliant. So, yeah, and this is a really important story that needs to be told. You've probably heard of Dr. J. Oppenheimer, one of the creators of the first atom bomb. And the movie basically is the story of it's the story of his life, but it's the story of the build up to that first test and the consequences of it, and the consequences for Oppenheimer personally, and his guilty conscience, and the end of the movie. I mean, there are going to be spoilers for the movie in this episode, by the way. We can't exactly do a podcast on episode without. So if you haven't seen it and you don't want to be spoiled, then go watch it. I recommend everyone watches it anyway, because I think it's a really important movie to watch. And come back, but yeah, that's kind of it. And of course, the ending is very, very powerful, with Oppenheimer kind of thinking about the possible consequences of his actions beyond his lifetime. and it just leaves you right there.
Oh yeah.
When I left the movie, I didn't talk for a while, and I was quite sad. Lots of people, I don't think anyone spoke as they left the cinema. It was, I don't know if that was
Mhm.
your experience as well, Douglas.
Yeah, I think there was definitely like a sense of, and you go to movies, and they are what they are for the most part. It's been a while since I went in a movie, and it's been a very long. I know the last time I went to a movie and everyone clapped at the end, which was the Lord of the Rings,
Mm,
Return of the King, and it's like, which I had seen. I saw all three in theaters. I'm dating myself here, like, oh, if not almost the day they came out,
same,
and at the end,
same.
like, we applauded. It was they were that good as far as like stories and obviously cinema. And I do recall, like, at the end of the movie, like, for the screening I went to for Oppenheimer, which I got to go to an IMAX screening, like, there was also applause, which I think it was just sort of,
Mm,
you could immediately tell that this was beyond just a powerful story, that this was a like cinematic masterpiece,
yeah,
in the sense of like, I'm watching a piece of film that is the height of filmmaking in that kind of like Spielberg kind of way. Um,
yeah.
And so I think there was a lot of appreciation there, but also in this, the sense of, there was just a lot to process there. And I think, as people were walking out, if I was really thinking about that, that probably was a little more muted than I would have expected. No one, you come out of Barbie, you're talking about all this, your favorite parts of
Yeah.
Barbie, and this part, like, I think I didn't get till the parking lot to turn to my dad, who I went and see, and then just like, what'd you think? And we were both, very impressed. But there was this sense of like, well, no one's coming out going like, that was such a fun movie. Like, no one's
Mm,
thinking that. We're all processing. So yeah, in a very similar kind of way, it's hard not to experience that and not to come away affected, if not changed.
mm,
And so yeah, I would definitely have felt that. Which, like I said, definitely has been a while since I've been in a theater watching a movie and felt that, especially in a communal sense. Like, I've been affected by movies, but then to feel like the audience is actually sharing that's something we've all shared, this singular experience.
yeah, I think that was my feeling of it as well. It's because I saw it in IMAX too,
Mm-hmm.
and really the way that they use the way that Christopher Nolan uses IMAX is, yeah, he's a master at it now. He's used it in so many movies. And this was shot entirely in IMAX cameras, and they
Mm-hmm.
even invented black and white IMAX cameras for the movie because Christopher Nolan wanted to shoot in black and white in IMAX, and they didn't have them, so Kodak just made them. So that, I mean, that's incredible as in itself. But it definitely adds to the movie, and like you're saying, it's an immersive experience because the screen is so big, firstly, but also the sound is all
Oh yeah.
around you. So when you have that moment when the bomb, the test happens,
Mm-hmm.
uh, it's so powerful because Chris Nolan uses sound so well in that scene because when the explosion happens, it's all silent
Mm-hmm.
because sound travels slower than light, right? And
Yeah.
it's such a brilliant bit of filmmaking because you're seeing this all happen. You're seeing people's reaction to it in silence, and then suddenly the noise hits you, and
Mm-hmm.
it's such a powerful moment, and it's because going from silence to maximum sound in an IMAX cinema is
Yes.
incredible, and just the way that it's built up, and the way that and the significance of it, and what this means, and just that moment is so powerful. It's brilliant filmmaking, and it just gets you all in the kind of in the emotions as well, and in the like. Because I found myself looking at everyone's reactions and their faces and the different reactions from different people, and
Mm-hmm.
like in the silence, before the sound hits, and then like it's almost like people are having a reaction, and then suddenly the reality of it, boom, there. It's like it's powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree that that particular moment, going in, I think we had discussions before about like, before we saw the movie, like kind of speculating as to how Nolan was going to structure things temporally wise, which Nolan is very good at playing with time, specifically through the medium of storytelling with movies. Someone actually reminded me that this isn't the first time he split a movie between color and black and white
Mm.
to show different. I think, believe Memento,
Yep.
which again, Memento is that kind of it's told backwards because the main character has sort of memory issues. That the black and white is in the same way that this movie did, in the very same way. That is also like that's the real life version, or that's a particular perspective that is less colored by the narrator. And in the same way, Oppenheimer, we have Oppenheimer's perspective, which is in color, and then the stark black and white reality, which is obviously black and white. So that just visually through that was always it's just amazing to see what Nolan's going to do with that. But we had discussed like where Trinity, where the A test was going to fall within the movie, and ended up being sort of basically plot point two as far as like 3 act structure,
Mm.
which makes sense. But going in, you kind of knew that was going to be a big moment. And what's amazing was that even knowing that wasn't, I was not prepared for how big that moment was.
Mm.
And I think that's that's the idea. You couldn't really, and where stories do very well, or good stories, is when we can kind of inhabit the mind of another person. And in this, we're obviously, for most of it, we're inhabiting Oppenheimer's mind, and we're seeing and experiencing things through his perspective. And so we are living up to the anticipation that he is. And we have, as the dramatic irony as audience members is that we know what happened and what didn't happen. He did not, and there's that kind of subplot where they talk about that there was a non-zero chance that when they lit this thing, that it caused a cataclysmic chain reaction that would basically end all life on the Earth. Which you got to think when your hand is above the button and you're waiting for it to count down, like how is that not going through your mind? And obviously that didn't happen, but in the sense of like in the moment, we're sort of inhabiting them
Yeah.
in the character of like we don't actually know what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. We can, and like Oppenheimer, the physicist, everyone else almost like they know what was going to happen. They've done the math, and they have enough math to know this is how atoms work. This is how we've designed it to work this way. Something could go wrong, but that's outside of if everything goes right, we know what it should do because they would be able
Yeah.
to take precautions, obviously. But there's also the sense of like that does not prepare you for watching it happen, and that sense of
Mm.
like you said, which I had seen before. I was telling my dad afterwards when they're doing all the pre-test of the conventional explosions that they use to initiate the implosion for the fission. When they're doing the test of those, there is the delay in the sound. You see the bomb explode, and then a second later you hear the crack. And so they actually put that in, which I was so impressed by because that's actually how it works. If you're at a bomb range and you set off a bomb, you're not going to hear the sound for a full second after you see it. But in movies, typically, if I'm going to show an explosion, I'm going to give you the sound at the same time. Otherwise, people are not going to understand. It's not going to,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that they set up this thing of like, you are, again, we're the perspective. We as the audience, we don't get to go everywhere. We're not at the bomb. We're a mile away where they are, where Oppenheimer is. And so what he sees is this insanely bright thing, brighter than the sun, happen. And there is enough time between that and the sound for him to contemplate what is happening. And then just this wall of sound, of course, hits you. And
Yeah.
which that alone, like obviously the visuals of IMAX are kind of the staple of IMAX. But I was telling my dad afterwards, like I had forgotten, like, oh yeah, the screen's 3 stories tall. The speakers are also 3 stories tall. And there's a lot of sound. This movie plays with sound as much as with visuals. And so I was not prepared for just the amount of sound. Like I was at a rock concert, like you felt that in your chest when it happened. And
Yeah.
I can't help but think, oh, that's also intentional by Nolan, that he, picking IMAX not only because we can get these very fantastic visuals, but because IMAX theaters kind of come built in with the kind of sound quality and force that would even more make this kind of palpable,
Mm,
which it really was.
yeah. Absolutely agree. Yeah, and you're right. It just it uses sound to tell a story as well, which is
Mm-hmm.
a very difficult thing to do.
Well,
But
it's
he does it
something
very
we
well.
typically see with like soundtracks,
Mm. Oh yeah,
and sound effects are there, but they're like a secondary thing. And this movie made sound effects as much a star as the soundtrack.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
actually, it's an interesting point you raised about the explosions. I remember in Interstellar, um, when there are explosions in space, you don't hear them because you can't hear
Yes.
them in space.
Hmm.
And like every movie in space, when you have explosions, you always hear them.
Yeah.
But in reality, that wouldn't happen. And of course, Christopher Nolan wants to be realistic as possible. And so in Interstellar, when the spaceship explodes in the kind of third
Hmm.
act or the final act, you don't hear it. You just see it, and it's actually more powerful when you don't hear it. Like for
Absolutely.
me, that made it more powerful because it's just it just explodes, and it's what that represents in that moment in that
Hmm.
movie because it means they can't go home. And
Yeah.
I mean,
Which,
we're talking about a different movie, but it's the same principle as he used in Oppenheimer with this explosion that you don't hear it straight away. Um,
yeah. And I'm fine doing a side for Interstellar. But
yeah,
like that, which that is a really good example of in storytelling, kind of giving you the reality of the experience and actually putting you there. Whereas I wouldn't be surprised if someone watched Oppenheimer and saw like just the test where they're doing the test on the explosions and we're like, hey, why is the sound delayed? Because every movie they've ever seen where there's a giant fire explosion and the superhero is walking away from it, not looking back because he's cool, like they hear the sound and like, oh, because that's not how explosions sound. They don't have this tiger roar to them. It is very violent but very quick. Like the pop is because it's the vacuum basically. Of the air being forced out and then being sucked back in. And so it's usually very quick and usually very loud. Um, but at the same, what he did obviously for Oppenheimer is kind of give the reality experience, and he did a very good job with Interstellar as well. Of we don't really understand unless you're like a super nerd like me, you don't understand the force of a explosive decompression. We think like, oh, someone opened the airlock and got sucked out. We don't understand like, no, that's an explosion. Like it would have the force to rip a ship apart, just having the airlock fail, which is in the moment. And so what being watching that, which also spoilers for Interstellar, Matt Damon in that scene where he's kind of in the middle of a speech, kind of explaining to them why he's doing what he's doing, which is he's doing something terrible, and they're trying to tell him like it's not going to work, and he's in the middle of that, and it explodes, and there's this violent like pop, and then we're suddenly outside the ship, and we just see fragments scattered, and it's that, like you said, it's this kind of it's this silent crescendo and like, oh no, and it's that sense of like, because we're left in silence, it's even more powerful. In the same way, in that A-bomb sequence, seeing giving us those visuals, which before we had those little inner bits of every time sort of Oppenheimer's brain is sort of every time we're
mm,
like shot inside, we have those visuals, which are amazing and just kind of like jarring. But there was always were accompanied by sound, and then we're actually at the moment and we see these amazing visuals, which again, not CGI, like we recreated these amazing fireball, and we're not given sound, and so we can't help but contemplate it.
exactly.
And I think that's the idea of like, in the same way we're given this sort of silent crescendo, oh, it's happening, oh, it's happening. It is very, very quiet, and we can't help but feel like we know we're getting ready because we know it's going to hit us. But you can't help but just contemplate that, and again, that feels very, as much as that is realistic. obviously movies aren't tied to that kind of realism in the sense of
Mm,
like the sound usually comes with the explosion. But by giving us that realism, again, it forces the contemplation of the moment
yeah,
of, oh,
yeah.
yeah.
He uses it as a storytelling tool and a way to
Hmm.
engage the audience with what's
Yeah.
going on because in silence you haven't got the sound of the movie to cover up your thoughts for you. You just got to
Hmm.
sit there and like, okay, you're watching what's happening, but there's no sound.
Yeah.
So you've just got your thoughts, like your reflections, your reactions, and also your instinct. And because it's not that, I mean, it's not in real time. It's not that long, but it's long enough for you
Hmm.
to just have an intuitive reaction rather than like a considered one. Like, what's your kind of gut reaction to this? Like, what is, and then you get the noise, like and
Hmm.
it's and it's yeah, it's powerful and it's brave. It's brave filmmaking to do that because
Oh
leave the
yeah.
audience in silence for even like in seconds.
Hmm.
It's brave, but Christopher Nolan uses it really, really well because he's a great filmmaker and storyteller.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think that it is reminiscent of a lot of modern stories. I was watching something about another movie, and they mentioned that I was actually the new Indiana Jones. They mentioned that, which I did enjoy, A Dial of Destiny. They were kind of comparing it to previous Indiana Jones, which is, of course, you're going to compare it to Raiders of the Lost Ark and stuff like that. And they mentioned like Raiders has this very kind of sweeping, but like it stays in locations a lot. And Dial of Destiny was just like boom, 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 kind of moving from one plot point to the next, and did kind of linger, which is that's modern cinematography. The very modern American filmmaking is very much like rapid, like filling time, and doesn't often like give a moment or even kind of slow down as far as the plot goes. Uh, and Oppenheimer, obviously, it's 3 hours long. There's a lot going on, but there are these moments where we're kind of forced to sit, and obviously, that's the biggest one, the Trinity test. But there are also, I think, if you go back, you'd find there's a lot of sort of like, you know, spaces in there where you're kind of left with just you have to kind of consider the situation, and
Mm,
again, silence, and any I feel like any poet or musician would tell you that silence is just as much part of of making sound or playing with sound as notes or music. In the same way, like when we talk about visual storytelling, whether from an artist or cinematographer's perspective, negative space is just as much part of the image. And so what we're given is this kind of like sonic negative space in very real sense, but also if you kind of would watch the movie again, I think you would find in smaller senses we're kind of getting the sense of there are spaces in the movie to kind of leave us where we
mm,
can't help but just sort of like contemplate what's going on, which is
yeah,
like you said, which is brave cinematography, because most modern American filmmaking does not do that. It is very we're
mm,
going from one thing to the next, rapid, rapid, rapid.
yeah. And a lot of those moments are where the camera's. There's a few moments in the movie where the camera just focuses on Oppenheimer's face, and
Mm.
he's
Hmm.
reacting to something, or he's thinking, he's contemplating. And this is brilliant acting by Cillian Murphy.
Oh yes.
Like, I mean, his eyes, like, they just hold your attention. Like, but there's some moments in the movie where things are happening, and the camera just pans to his face and to see his reaction. Um, and there's often this kind of sense of like, like it's mixed feelings in his face. Like,
Oh yes.
we have done something amazing, but what have we done?
Hmm.
Or what are we doing? And like you can see the weight of what they're doing is etched in his face even before they do it. Um, and obviously, some scenes take place after the test because it's told kind of in kind of reflection from he's you know being interviewed by a panel about his security clearance, and that's kind of the context of the story is told in a sense from Oppenheimer's point of
Hmm.
view.
Yeah.
And that starts obviously after the bomb has gone off, and so there's always that sense of like when the camera just pans to his face and other things are happening, and you can
Hmm.
see you don't even need doesn't need to say anything. You know, of course, the biggest example of that is one of my other favorite scenes in the movie, which is just after the test, and you know the scene
Hmm.
I'm talking about. Like I think where he's going into the room to talk to all these people that have worked on it and
Oh yeah.
congratulate them, and I was that was uh, still I can't really describe the scene in words because you have to see it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's essentially Oppenheimer's demons in his face while he's celebrating, like while he's saying one thing and the crowd the room are responding in one way, but you're seeing into his head,
Hmm.
and and basically you're seeing all the demons that he's creating in his head and the consequences and how he feels about what he's done or how he's responsible, and it's the way that it's done with the music and the visuals and everything. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. um I was really moved by that scene. Like I was, and
Hmm.
it surprises you. You don't expect it, and that's why it's so good. One of the reasons it's so good is because you don't expect that to happen because you haven't had a scene like that in the movie so far. And it's so powerful. It's kind of that duality of we're celebrating this achievement, but I am feeling the weight of this already
Hmm.
and the consequences of it, and I'm seeing those in my head, and I'm like, and then it's just it's difficult to describe because I
No,
can't
I'm
adequately
right there
describe it.
with you.
You have to watch it to see to understand.
Yeah.
But it's brilliant filmmaking and brilliant acting as well.
No, I'm right there with you. That scene was almost, I would say, as powerful as the test itself.
Mm,
And and again, another scene that plays with sound and silence so well because he walks in and there is this basically kind of like assembly hall for the town, and all these people are on risers and they're just stomping their feet in celebration, and it's thundering and it's deafening, and he's walking out, and you again, the face acting is, which another achievement of amazing filmmaking, that this is a blockbuster film that is mostly just looking at people talking, and that is hard to do in American filmmaking, but that we can see on his face the conflicted nature that he knows he has to say this because he's asked so much of these people. These are his colleagues and friends, and he has to tell them basically like we're won, we're successful, like all your sacrifices meant something, and he has to tell them that, but at the same time carrying the weight of the gravity of what has been achieved. And that roaring
mm,
stops, and it stops when the people are suddenly gone and the people are back and it's still silent, and that
mm,
silence is more oppressive than the thunderous applause that he's getting.
yeah.
And it's like I felt trapped, and I think again that was on purpose, of that kind of sort of inevitability of what had been done, and that it is definitely an aspect of that storyline where, as we're going up to Trinity, there's this, you see in Oppenheimer, and it's that switch where, and Cillian Murphy basically, from the beginning to the end of the movie, Cillian Murphy looks like he actually aged. I know there's makeup involved, but like
Yeah,
just the
I know,
way
I
his
agree.
eyes look,
Yeah.
like there's something changed in there. But that scene especially is got kind of the change of, up until that point, up until Trinity, there was this kind of feeling of, maybe we can stop. That maybe once we've proven that it can be done and we've succeeded, there's not any reason to do the next step. And
Mm,
over and over and over again, what is illustrated to him is that is out of his hands, first of all, but also in the sense that that's not something anyone was ever gonna to do. He was never gonna be able to convince them not to drop it. And that scene especially is illustrated so well, and you again feel through the visuals and the sound of, dear God, what have we done? And
yeah.
that is,
Mm,
I completely agree with you, that is such a powerful scene. And could not help but feel the emotionality of that sequence.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
no, it's, oh.
I know.
And yeah, I also agree. Very hard to put into words how powerful it
You
was.
can't. Yeah, there's some things that you. I mean, there's a reason that it's a movie.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
There's some that. I mean, I think that's a sign of good filmmaking, though. When you can't
Mm-hmm.
adequately describe a scene in words, and you just need to see it.
Oh yeah.
It's that means they've done their job, And you're right. And there's actually a scene just after that where Oppenheimer is like trying to advise them to like, are you going to drop this, or maybe you shouldn't drop this, and like all the army generals are like, well, it's already been decided. Like, I think basically, it's almost like there's like
Yeah.
this shift of almost like of power. Like it's like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
it's like the army generals are like, hey, you've done your job. You're done. You're done. You don't get a say anymore. Like we'll take it from here, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this kind of, I don't know what Oppenheimer really felt at the time. He must have known they were going to use it, but there is this kind of sense of like this sinking feeling. I had this sinking feeling of like, this is what always happens. Like,
Yeah.
we like they take out that. I mean, we call it the system. You can call it capitalism. You can call it government. You can call it, whatever you want to call it. But those people take over, like
Mm-hmm.
from the scientists, from the experts, from the creative people. They take what's been done and they just use it for things that maybe it shouldn't be used for. And the kind of I did a bit of research on it, and they decided to drop the bomb before they'd done the test. They'd already decided, and like it was like they just wanted to make sure that the test, because I think Hiroshima happened only a few days later. It wasn't long after, was it? It
It's
was
yeah.
they because they
That was the really surprising thing, because I knew enough about the historical events to know one happened before the other. I did not realize how close Trinity was to actually dropping the bomb.
hmm,
And then that scene in particular, like them deciding to drop the bomb, happened before Trinity. So they're like, we haven't actually proven the bomb will work, and we're already planning on what we're going to do with it. And so, in the sense of once Trinity was done, that's it. Like that's that. In like what you said, Oppenheimer's part is almost like over. Like, oh, you did what we asked you to do. You made this terrible weapon, and now we're going to go use it like we told you we're gonna. And then it's just like, which is again the powerfulness of the scene of, and this was true, that the scientists at Los Alamos did not know that Hiroshima had happened until they heard it on the radio. So
yeah,
they found out
yeah.
at the same time the rest of the world.
That is
And then
incredible, isn't it? I mean,
and then
I didn't even
what
know
Oppenheimer
that until I saw the
gets,
movie.
and and then what Oppenheimer gets as far as congratulations is a phone call from the general, and basically like, hey, then that's it. In the sense of like, wait, are we not going to discuss the gravity of what just happened?
Yeah,
And yeah, that's which,
yeah.
right, yeah.
It's just that, yeah. That is quite staggering, really. That they didn't even know it had happened until after it happened.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and I think that one part of the tragedy of this story is that that they started building. The scientists weren't unaware of what they were doing. They knew
Mm-hmm.
that it probably wasn't a good idea. They knew it was what the consequences could be, but they were in this kind of place where they almost felt they had no choice because the question they were asking themselves is what if Hitler gets one of these? Like,
Yeah.
what if he gets one before we do? Then we're doomed because Hitler wouldn't have any qualms about dropping multiple atomic bombs all over the world, right? If he had access to them, and so it's kind of I kind of empathize in that, like when you've got someone like Hitler in charge of nuclear weapons or potentially,
Mm-hmm.
you've got to do something. It's almost like they were like, well, we don't have a choice. We've got to do this. And then by the time they actually get close to completing the project, Hitler is dead and actually didn't have any nuclear weapons at all, and hadn't made the progress with that people thought he had. And
Mm-hmm.
but then it's too late. It's kind of the cat's out
Yeah.
of the bag at that point, and it's happening. And I think even there's a moment of reflection from Oppenheimer, like, Hitler's dead. Do we stop now? I think
Yeah.
there is a moment of where he says that, and it's like, well, no, we're too far into this now. This is going to
Hmm.
happen, like basically, like, um, and
Yeah.
yeah, and that's a tragedy, really, because it like that you would think there's a certain set of circumstances where this could have been stopped before it got to
Mhm.
that point, but at the same time, you also think, well, this somebody would have developed this technology eventually, even it would have, whether it's the Soviet
Mhm.
Union or or America, somebody would have developed this at some point, because that's human nature, is curiosity, and also to
Mhm.
weaponize things that we create, and um or use them for profit.
Yeah.
It's
And it's
yeah,
mhm.
it's kind of the human wrapped up in this movie is like the ongoing human tragedy, in a sense of
Mhm.
what we do with what we create, what we do with the knowledge that we discover, what we do with um the scientific breakthroughs that we make. you know um
And what we do with the people who make them.
yeah, exactly.
That's kind of
Yeah.
which it's interesting. I mean, it's the irony of this movie coming out in the middle of the strike. And I was watching on Instagram, Adam Conover. He's a writer. He had a TV show called like Adam Ruins Everything. We kind of talked about like actual facts and societal stuff. And he's a writer. Obviously, he's with the strike. He's done some other projects, and he's been posting obviously on his social media different things about the strike. And he mentioned that obviously one of the points in both the actors and writers strike is use of AI,
Mm.
and
Yeah.
how we're going to deal with this. And he mentioned is again the irony of this movie coming out and during this strike, and that we're talking about it. Then he mentioned like AI is not the problem. The technology is not the problem. Technology on its surface just is kind of this like, hey, look what we can do with the things, and isn't that cool? And that's if that's all it was, that'd be all it was. And, and he mentioned specifically, he draw the parallel. He's like, it's not about the technology itself; it's about what certain people want to do with it. In the same way, and he actually drew this parallel. Splitting the atom is not the problem. That's science that we wanted to figure out. That's how we figure out what an atom was made of is we split it apart. Like, and we still do that in super colliders. We're splitting the atom all the time. That's not the problem. The problem is making a bomb out of that.
Yeah.
And it takes a certain kind of person to take this, what is essentially a scientific curiosity or technological curiosity, and saying, let's do this with it. And that being something that is at best morally questionable, but far closer to something like morally reprehensible. And it's that gulf between the science and um, again what society does with it. And you said it perfectly. Of the tragedy of the situation is a human one, and the best stories are human stories, and it's the sense of like what can we and can we not be trusted with. And it's that scene that you had mentioned where they're talking about dropping the bomb, and I believe it was like the Secretary of State and the Joint Chiefs, and Oppenheimer is there, and he's been invited. And you can kind of see that's sort of where the first sort of thing starts slipping out of his hands, because you can see as he's kind of suggesting to them, and again, this is pre-Trinity; they haven't actually proven the bomb will work, and they kind of talk about the timeline, and he's doing what a good scientist would be like. Well, I don't know if we can move that fast, but and the general's next to him, kind of like he's speaking the military talk now. And you can see in that moment, kind of the discussion, it quickly becomes like to the other men in the room, white men in the room, let's be real,
Yeah.
that, well, of course we're going to drop the bomb. Like, why wouldn't we drop? Like, and there's that line where the Secretary of State pulls out, he's like, I have a list of 12 cities. Oh, mark that 11. And he crosses out, he's like, I'm taking off Kyoto because it's beautiful, which Kyoto is like the oldest Japanese city
Mm.
for its cultural and significance. Also, my wife and I, we honeymooned there. It's a beautiful city,
Yeah.
and just the like cognitive dissonance of the entire scene, which you can see on Oppenheimer's face as he's watching this men discuss what they're going to do. and the sense of, and then I think if it's either him or someone else mentions, well, okay, what are some military targets? And they mention like maybe a fort or a port or something, and someone comes back with too small, which that like gave me pause in the sense of like, why is that a problem? Like if we can wipe this, like if it's a target that's smaller than our blast radius, then wouldn't that be as effective as dropping it on something slightly larger? Like what? Why are we arguing over the size of the vaporization? Like, well, it won't be worth it if we can't
Yeah.
really destroy things.
Yeah.
And then that line about Kyoto in the sense of like, oh, they think they're being just. And the Secretary of State saying, like, I'm taking off Kyoto, like, I'm doing them a favor. Like, we won't blow up your most precious city. We'll just blow up some smaller city with people in it. And
Yeah. I know.
it's not a military target because that wouldn't be enough to convince you. And then obviously we're going to do two to show you, one, we have this, and two, we'll continue doing this until, we're done with you.
Mhm.
And and you can, again, this is on purpose of these men discussing this not unseriously, but so already like
Mhm.
no one's sitting here except no one but Oppenheimer seems to be sitting here weighing the moral judgment of it. They're more like, what's the practical like
Yeah.
application?
Yeah.
The moral judgment's an answered for them. And it's that kind of sense of that we, the audience, through his perspective, because he is the protagonist, we are attaching our emotions to him. They understand, oh, it was never a moral question for them.
No.
Or if it was, it didn't take they're not
Yeah.
they're not wrestling with it. And he's the only one in the room wrestling with it. And that being the first sort of clue of like, oh, there was never a chance of it. The moment I told them we could do this, it was always going to be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The moment that we could make a bomb, they were always going to use it.
Mm.
And that being,
Yeah.
again, flashing forward to the end of the movie where he's in that, what is basically a trial, calling into question his loyalty after giving and asking, the prosecutor, just grilling him like he's a criminal, and just asking, when did you have doubts? And he's like, when I figured out that any weapon I gave them would be used, that there was no limit to the destructive capability. They'd be like, maybe you don't need to use that. That was never a question. It just the bigger the bomb always has to be bigger, and if they have it, we have to have a bigger bomb. And that being, you can understand from Oppenheimer's perspective, having seen what he has seen, experienced what he experienced, of being like, the moment you figured out they're never going to stop, like, I can either consign myself to participate with it, or I can opt out. And just understanding that that's kind of where he came to, but his own, and then that been since basically his own moral stipulations made him now the enemy. Because it was the 50s. It's the Cold War.
Yeah.
You don't get to call into question the morality of our actions. That is a given. And again, it's the men in the room. Obviously, we're the good guys. So whatever we do must be the good thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if we're not going to bomb their biggest city, and we're not going to wipe out all their people, that's a kindness on our part. And that being,
I know that.
so,
Yeah. It's just
so far from anything considered moral, but that being the reality of the situation.
Yeah, and the other thing as well I found out is that the actor who said that guy that talked about, oh, we won't bomb that city,
mm-hmm.
that was a real person, and he actually said that. And it wasn't in the script originally. The actor who played him did research on the character and found out that he said that. And so he improvised that in the scene because that's something that he actually said. And that makes it even more powerful. Real people said this. Like they had no conscience, almost, like this kind of sense that we are the guardians of morality. Therefore, we get to decide what is just and what is right and what isn't. And other people and our enemy don't get to decide that because they're not moral. Basically judging every single person who lived in these countries as if that they were all of them with it. And of course, this was propaganda. This is what people were brainwashed into believing that everybody who lived in those countries was the enemy. And that's what happens during war. But nevertheless, the
Mhm.
kind of the dehumanizing of people,
Oh yeah.
like, is on this staggering scale. And I think that's the thing as well. That Oppenheimer was, he didn't realize this at first. He assumed everyone else was like him and had a conscience, and like, we will only drop these if it's appropriate to do so. Um,
Mhm.
and there's that, and again, it's Cillian Murphy's face acting that does this, like this realization that, oh, this was, they'd never cared about, they never had a conscience about this. This was just a
Yeah.
mission, um, and there was no chance that they weren't going to do this, like you say, And it was, yeah, it's, it's, and you're right about it being a message for all technology, all
Mhm.
innovation. I mean, like Mission Impossible, the recent Mission Impossible movie kind of touched on AI and the power
Yeah.
of AI. And that was one of the things I loved about that movie, was that it really explored that really in depth, and it felt more realistic because of that. And yeah, like, it's the same thing. Like, we're going to, like, when we create new technology, like, are we responsible enough as a species to steward it well? And the answer keeps
Mhm.
being no. um, and
Yeah.
that is, that's troubling. And, like, I had a lot of reflections after I saw the movie about that, and about, obviously, nuclear weapons and the situation in the world at the moment, and people who've got control of nuclear weapons who really shouldn't. And yeah, it's and that's what the movie leaves you with. It's like this kind of reflection of, this kind of constant tragedy of humanity and the inability of humanity to steward things responsibly. Like, I had this sense of, like, we're children, we're like kids in a toy store. We're like toddlers playing with sharp knives and guns, like, and loaded guns. Like, that's what we're doing.
Mhm.
We've got the ability to create these things, but we haven't got the maturity to use them. And well, the people in charge haven't got the maturity to use them anyway. There's some people that I would trust to, well, do the right thing, because they probably wouldn't use them; they probably destroyed them. But um, but but yeah, like, it's yeah, the legacy of that movie is really powerful.
Absolutely. I think that's, it's definitely one of those movies that needed to get made simply because it's a story that needed to be told.
Mm.
And it's a little, I remember, so the script that Nolan wrote was obviously adapted from uh, a biography of Robert Oppenheimer called American Prometheus.
Mhm.
And the author had mentioned that when a couple weeks back, that the book is a number of years old, and because of the gravity of the story, other people have tried to write scripts about it and never quite captured, and the reason the story has not been made yet, because none of those scripts quite captured uh, the story itself, and that it wasn't until Nolan writing the script actually captured this story. And so it's one of those kind of, it's a little surprising, but at the same time, like, it's a little surprising that we haven't had an Oppenheimer biopic yet. And this this is a story that is 70, almost 80 years old now.
Yeah,
And but at the same time, one of those things like, oh, it's probably a good thing, because it would have been really hard not to write that as propaganda up until a certain point.
mm.
Like, um,
Yeah,
and you kind of needed, obviously, this movie. So it's one of those stories that you immediately kind of know, in that very kind of Schindler's List way, like, this is an important story. As much as this is good filmmaking, this is also a story we need to be exposed to, because we need to remind ourselves of the history of
yeah,
it.
yeah,
And with that, and it's just one of those things, like, it's good to point out a lot of, there's been criticism, and I don't want to say that in the sense of, like, it's bad, because I think criticism can very much is part of the experience, because stories are never going to cover everything. And there's things this story didn't cover that did happen, just maybe not to the character. And so it's kind of a focused story on this. And now that we've had this, I mentioned to you before, now that we have the Oppenheimer movie, it is now time to make the other movies that we need to make.
Yeah.
Notably, we need, and when I say we, I mean American cinema, but obviously someone connected with this. But we need the Hiroshima movie. Like that's a movie we need to see because that's something we need to understand because
Yeah.
we need to see the consequences of this. In the same way, I it's been going around social media. Someone mentioned that the displaced people who lived in Los Alamos, because people lived in Los Alamos before. An author mentioned that they had written a screenplay about their story because they also have suffered at the hands of the nuclear test, not just being displaced, but I think the community is still dealing with the fallout from the original test.
Yeah.
And has a very high instance of certain defects. And then corollary to that, I think, has like one of the highest uses of heroin in the country because they are still dealing with the generational trauma of this. And that's also a story that needs to be told.
I think cancer as well. People have developed cancer,
mm-hmm.
various types. And that's an important story that needs to be told as well. We need mm-hmm. to hear all these stories because, I mean, we need the whole story now. We need the human story. People's stories deserve to be told, and one thing actually I like about this movie is it doesn't make Oppenheimer into a hero, like it's a big American hero. It's not one of those kind of movies. It's almost, I wouldn't say it's the opposite, but it paints him as it portrays him as a human being who is very mm-hmm. conflicted about what he has done and about the morality of it and the consequences of it, and makes mistakes in his personal life, makes mistakes in professional life, and is very, very human. And that's down to the acting, it's down to the writing and the direction. It humanizes Oppenheimer very much. And I mean that's made more so obviously by Cillian Murphy's performance. His best performance, I mean, he's a great actor. I've always loved Cillian Murphy as an actor, but he needs to get an Oscar for this movie. It's an incredible performance, and I mean, there's lots of Oscars that need to get given for this movie, but I'm sure it will win the Oscars. I'm pretty sure it will win Oscars this year. But it's great. It's just great movie making, and and actually, there's one scene at the end where we haven't talked about this character much, but Robert Downey Jr.'s character, who's kind of set up as kind of the Salieri to, and Chris Nolan's actually mentioned this comparison, Salieri to kind of Oppenheimer's Mozart. And I've forgotten the name of the character. That's going to annoy me.
It's Strauss.
That's it. Yes, Strauss, and this is another Oscar-worthy performance, by the way.
I was about to say we haven't talked about him. That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, I mean,
we could just talk about Robert Downey Jr.
He was kind of his Salieri, I suppose. But at the end of the movie, when he is facing the consequences of what he did, and there's a whole bunch of great performances here, cameos. Like half of this movie is absolutely stellar. I think Rami Malek is in it for about 10 minutes and has one spoken scene, and he absolutely he could win an Oscar for that.
Kills it.
It's unbelievable. Anyway, but they mentioned one of the people that voted against him was a senator from Massachusetts, and
yes.
And I actually thought that was probably intentional because you remember that Kennedy was president during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yes.
And I've read a lot about that period of history, seen lots of documentaries, and he was he had the generals all around him pushing him to go to war.
Yeah.
Right. And he refused to do so. And actually he and Khrushchev almost decided between them that we don't want a nuclear war. Like,
Yeah.
as much as we are political opponents, we do not want a nuclear war. And it was almost decided between those two, without like, all their generals like wanted nuclear war, right? And these two people kind of decided, no, we're not going to do this. And Kennedy had wanted to end the Cold War. He'd wanted to end the arms race. Um, so there's an element of this story continuing almost in a sense,
Yeah.
and another tragedy because you know Kennedy was assassinated, and you can say what you think what you like about who assassinated him and why, but the reality is that he was assassinated, and that ended a lot of that,
Yeah.
and led to Vietnam as well. And I mean, I'd love. I was actually saying this on Twitter. I'd love to see a movie from Christopher Nolan called Kennedy and Khrushchev, which centers their relationship
Hmm.
completely, um, and around this missile crisis, um, and like how those human decisions changed will stop nuclear war when people all around were. I mean, that would be an interesting movie. And there's already been a movie about the missile crisis, which is very good, called 13 Days, I think it's called.
Yes, I was
But
just thinking
I
that.
there's something I mean that would love to see Nolan do a take on that, but he probably won't. But it was just an interesting little thread because of Kennedy's perspective on on the arms race and nuclear
Hmm.
weapons and what he actually did to prevent nuclear war. To just add that little
Yeah,
name in there at the end was just that little kind of teaser.
a little nod. Yeah, and it's kind of very historical, like this actually happened kind of way, but also in this sort of like I think you had mentioned before, like that's it's a little bit like the Nick Fury at the end of Iron Man sort of nod as to
Yeah,
like, oh, other things are going on.
yeah,
There's actually this bigger
and
universe.
Batman Begins as
It,
well, where the
yeah,
Joker card.
with the Joker
Yeah,
card, yeah, which is feels very Nolan, but I would definitely agree with you. I think because it makes me think, there has been movies about the missile crisis. 13 Days is most recent, and but definitely, from what I know of that is much more sort of a broad kind of like
yeah,
describing an historical event that a lot of people just don't know about. I think the tagline for the movie is "You won't believe how close we came," which is a lot of people just were not aware of that. Even now, like in hindsight, we're not really taught that in schools. And so that was, that served its kind of purpose in this sort of broad, sort of like informational. But I agree with you, like a very focused, personal, especially between these two individuals who are, very powerful, pivotal men at the crux of history there. And I think I would really enjoy that because, and another thing that Oppenheimer has done is kind of show like, again, the kind of stories we can tell, and that a lot of when we do like these historical epics, which it's hard not to call it an epic, they tend to be kind of the eagle's eye view. We're trying to tell as much about
mm,
what happened as we can, and we want to get the whole thing. We want to get the whole sort of picture of this particular event, and it makes sense. But at the same time, like history is a human story, and human stories are very personal, and so that we often can, in looking at the forest, we can often miss the trees. And Oppenheimer is such a great, it's partly because we have a person in Oppenheimer who was positioned to tell this story, but that Oppenheimer, as much as it is a story about a big historical event, is very like again, we see mostly faces. It's very focused,
yeah,
and it's interesting seeing an historic. I could definitely see a story about Los Alamos in this sort of broad with an all-star cast, but still in this sort of broad kind of like just trying to tell the facts as much as they can and miss a lot of the details and the personal details.
mm,
And so whereas this what is essentially a biopic still is epic in the quality, but is so much more focused in that way. As much as we're getting the facts of the situation, we are also understanding the gravity of the situation in a way that you can watch a movie that tells you all the facts. You can watch a documentary that tells you all the facts of what happened and maybe not fully, depending on how well it's made, not fully understand the gravity of the situation. And this is a story that tells us the facts, but also gives the gravity. And so, like, where if you had the Kennedy Khrushchev, that would be really interesting to watch, because again, we would get the aspect that's missing from the sort of the broader stories of this very personal quality of human beings lived through this. And this is how we really understand stories best, is when we're told it through the eyes of someone.
Yeah.
And that is storytelling at its finest,
Yes.
is when we actually get a perspective. We're actually on the
Mm.
ground.
Mm.
And that's something this movie does so well, that it adds, I would say it is part of, or the lion's part of the power of this film. Not just the amazing cinematography, the soundscape, all that, but that we are seeing this through someone's perspective, and we are feeling what they are feeling as it is happening.
Yeah, the humanizing
Mm-hmm.
story, the personal story with the bigger story. Like we talk about this in, offline, kind of like about how there's always in movies there's often there's the bigger story of what's happening, but there's in good storytelling there's human stories at the front of it, which
Yeah.
you're concerned about. Like, I mean, example, Star Wars, right?
Yeah.
Return of the Jedi. The big story is let's destroy the Empire. The real story
Yeah.
is Anakin and his son, right? And Anakin saving his father. Like that's the story that, I mean, when I watch it, that's the story I'm most invested in. But there's still this big story that's happening, which is valid. But the heart of the story is these two characters, or three characters of the Emperor, like that are driving it. And Christopher Nolan does that in his movies a lot, and very, very well. And he does it in this movie, because Oppenheimer is the character that you are. He even wrote the script in the first person of Oppenheimer. Like the scenes, the color scenes, which are basically Oppenheimer's perspective, are all written in the first person. And the other scenes are not written in the first person because they're more objective and they're more the alternative perspective. And that's good writing, obviously, but it's an example of how we're seeing this big story, but we're seeing it through the lens of one character in particular, or two characters potentially, because Strauss as well is equally important in the story, and we see his perspective as well. So, yeah, I agree. So, yeah, go and see this movie, everyone, and do reflect on it if you haven't seen it already. It's a really great movie. I doubt it'll be on the cinemas by the time this comes out, but see it on as big a screen as you can, if you haven't already. And yeah, take time with it and sit with it. It's a great movie in every sense. So thank you, Douglas, for coming on. And it's always good to chat to you and have you on the show.
Absolutely.
And I'm sure we'll have you back again.
By the time this airs, Loki season 2 will have come out, and we might have already recorded a podcast for that.
They might come out the week after each other. Like,
yeah, you might hear me twice in the same month. So
yeah, we'll do an episode on that for sure. I can already see from the trailer that's going to have a lot of stuff to talk about. So yes. So enjoy that when that comes out, which again will be out after the writer's strike is finished.
Yes.
So yes, thanks everyone for listening. Thanks Douglas for coming on, and take care, everyone.
You too.